Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Gary, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Happy to speak with you. Could you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Thanks, Robbie. I really appreciate the opportunity to continue to talk about JFK and what has happened over the last 59 years. I have I guess, a unique set of circumstances that arose when I was a sophomore in high school in 1963. And I was living in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And I grew up pretty much right on the campus. I mean, it was across the street, so it was my playground. And I knew the University of North Dakota like the back of my hand. And when Kennedy was scheduled to come to the university to receive an honorary degree, it was a big deal. And so I ended up there. And strangely enough, in the front row with my buddy, who we say accidentally breached security, because we were just intent on getting to a point where we could hear his speech and so on. So backing up a little bit, I grew up in North Dakota. I live in Minneapolis, or suburban Minneapolis now, for the last 32 years. And prior to that, I was out in Southwest Minnesota for 15. I've been a history, social studies teacher most of that time, sometimes a counselor, high school counselor. And in 1993, I ended up teaching at John F. Kennedy High School in Bloomington, Minnesota, about a mile from the Mall of America, if you've heard of that. And so
Kennedy's been around your whole life, huh?
Yeah, and it was just a coincidence that I ended up at a high school with his name. It wasn't like I saw the name of the high school and applied for a job. It was something that was there and available. If it had been a high school with a different name, I would have been there. I could have been at the other one in Bloomington called Jefferson, but it was a lot more fun to be at one called JFK and to be teaching about the assassination. And I remember once I ran into Jesse Ventura at a book signing at a Barnes and Noble in the Mall of America. And I didn't buy his book. I just went through the line so I could say hi to him. And I said, by the way, I teach about the assassination over at Bloomington Kennedy High School, just a stone's throw from here. And he says, they let you do that? Well, that's kind of the stereotypical view of what teachers can do, right? I mean, a lot of people think you're limited and you can't go into controversial topics, but I did for a lot of years. And I would have parents that would come to parent-teacher conferences and thank me because for the first time their kids were interested in history. So the fact that it's the biggest mystery of the 20th century and on into the 21st was something that students just gravitated to and wanted. I still have students after having retired in 2012 that sometimes call me, email me, text me with questions that they still have from the 90s and into the early 2000s. So that's rewarding to see that I had some effect on students that now are older than you are.
When it comes to your start of the JFK research, when did it start for you and where did you particularly focus?
Well, like I alluded to briefly at the beginning there, um, Kennedy was getting an honorary degree at the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks, and I grew up across the street from the arena where he was speaking. So it was like falling off a log to get to his talk, even though we had school that day, September 25th, 1963, 2 months before the assassination. And my buddy and I knew the back doors to every building at the University of North Dakota because it was our playground. We'd been kicked out of every building as kids. Uh, and, it was a case of getting to the place where Kennedy was going to speak and seeing that there were already 30,000 people in the arena and outside the building. And we thought, we're never going to get close. So we racked our brains and went in a door that the public hadn't gone in that day, and to get to their seats. And of course, it was free. So the place was packed. I think there were 12, 15,000 in the arena. And we went in actually a front door where the coaches' offices were for football and basketball and everything at the university. And we made our way through 4 sets of doors that weren't locked, and nobody was guarding them. It was like there was nothing going on in the building. And here there were 12, 15,000 people in the arena and another 30,000 outside around the field where Kennedy's helicopter landed when it took off from the nuclear air base about 15 miles out of town. And so we go through these 4 sets of doors with no security in evidence. And we opened up one last door. It was a steel door that went from an office area into the upper seats of the arena at the other end of the arena from where the stage was. And all of a sudden, I think my head is in the door, and I say to my friend Bruce, I see 2 seats right in front of the podium, and everything is full, and there's still 2 empty seats right there. And we could see them, the length of the arena somehow. So we made our way through the crowd, and we got there, and there was a Secret Service agent standing right in front of the 2 seats. And we actually had to kind of ease by him because he was so close to those 2 empty seats. And he didn't even look at us. We're kids, we're 15 years old. He's scanning the crowd for what I think can surmise they knew Kennedy was being stalked. And I can say later why I think that was and what the evidence for that is. But at any rate, we sat down. Kennedy came in 5 minutes later. So we just barely made it. And the place went nuts. I mean, the first 20 rows had been given to a lot of co-eds who, Kennedy was a movie star as far as they were concerned. And they literally jumped onto their chairs. And I turned around and I thought I must be at a Beatles concert. And they were literally pulling their hair and weeping. I mean, I was really surprised that they got that emotional. I mean, now I understand it, but at the time it was, they were 5, 6 years older than me as university students. And at any rate, Kennedy gave the speech, and this was part of what they called the conservation tour of 1963. And he had done it the year before in 62 and liked the experience. So he said, let's do another 5-day tour through the Western states, and the subject will be conservation. So in North Dakota, it was about the Missouri River and the power that was generated from a dam out in the middle of the state. I was on the eastern edge of the state on the Minnesota border at the University of North Dakota. And so, we heard the speech, walked away from it. We're 15. We're not really that into what he's talking about. We just are blown away by the size of the crowd and so on. And it wasn't like we walked away immediately saying, gee, how did we get through those 4 doors? Now we might have, but I don't remember doing that. And a few years went by, and I don't think I'm still actually starting to investigate what happened. So when I say I started investigating the assassination 2 months before it happened, is hyperbole, right? But at the same time, it was an indelible impression that I took away with me. How did we get to those seats? How could they still be open? Well, 40 years later, this man who had been the president of the university, when I asked him about what he thought about the assassination, he said, well, I didn't think it could happen in Dallas, so maybe it could have happened in Grand Forks at this university. I said, we found 2 empty seats in front of the podium. Now there was a 20, 30-foot safety space between the first row of seats and the podium where Kennedy stood. But his response was, oh, those were my tickets. I didn't give them away that day. I had to be in Western North Dakota giving a speech to the League of Cities. So it took me 40 years to find out why those seats were empty. So the takeaway when that happens is kind of like, okay, what else can I discover about that day, now 59 years ago in 2 months or whatever? And the circumstances around that day, and I'll call it breaching security, are pretty extensive in terms of my buddy's father, who was a close friend of H.L. Hunt, the Texas oil man. And here he was living next door to me. And one thing led to another. And one day not until 1992, when Dick Russell published The Man Who Knew Too Much, did it really hit me, because in The Man Who Knew Too Much, he mentions that that people were planning the assassination for late September of '63. And I said to myself, wait a minute, when did I see Kennedy? So I go to the archives, and I find that it was September 25th. And that's when Richard Case Nagel, who Dick Russell says is the man who knew too much, he describes how he gets himself arrested in El Paso, Texas on the 20th. Now, I don't know, are you aware of any of this part of?
I knew about prior assassination plots, and I know about the existing relationship between Kennedy and the Secret Service, and also the Secret Service and Johnson. So I haven't heard of this speech or any involvement or assassination attempt that could be possibly or potentially at one of these places.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the clincher for me was that Dick Russell was able to get information from Richard Case Nagel about an end of September '63 assassination attempt. And Nagel thought, not knowing much more than that it was going to happen, assumed it was going to happen in DC, because I'm sure he was unaware of the conservation tour that Kennedy was going to take for 5 days from September 24th, actually, yeah, September 24th through about the 29th, 5 days. And now you have to excuse me a bit if I if I hesitate, I've had 4 surgeries on various parts of my body in the last approximately 2 years. And so I'm beginning to think that it affected my memory when you go under like that.
Well, take your time, man. You're just talking to me. There's no rush on anything. I'm just interested in learning more about that day. I mean, you have to ask. I mean, you're basically now starting to stumble into accidentally researching the assassination of JFK, what leads to kind of the main event where it actually, I guess their mission succeeded. And it all started just because you wanted to go see Kennedy's speech. And, I mean, that's weird to me. I mean, I'm already thinking about questions to ask about the Secret Service. I've had Vince on here and he talked about how the Secret Service hated Kennedy in a way on some things. And I mean, that's major security to have 4 doors unlocked where 2 16-year-old kids, 15-year-old kids are able to pop right in and be able to sit front row. I mean, it's a big
Yeah.
security risk.
Yeah. I mean, what did we see 2 days ago? A 15-year-old went on a shooting rampage. So yeah, in 1963, kids were less likely to be running around with guns because they were traumatized from something in their life. But still, like you say, it was really strange for those doors. As we walked in, there was a sharpshooter 4 floors up on the roof. We saw one. There could have been others, and they were observing the space around the arena, including where Kennedy had landed in his helicopter and then taken a limousine about a block and a half from his helicopter to the door of the arena. And guess who was driving the limo? Mr. Greer, who was driving the limo in Dallas. Now, I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know who he was. So the total amount of evidence of little pieces like Greer driving the limo and being in Dallas. I mean, there's hundreds of those examples of not just coincidence, but it all fits together at some point, and you have a vision that makes more sense that there was a conspiracy versus just random events that you experienced, and you have to run with that. And the indelible experience of sitting in the front row and seeing him give a speech and then dead 2 months later was going to set me up for the rest of my life trying to figure out how that could happen. So there's a book called Farewell America, which you may have heard of. It's usually very disparaged in that it had to be smuggled into the United States. I think it was 5,000 copies from Montreal back in let's say the 70s. And I saw, the fact that people disparage its legitimacy is one thing, but because I had the experience I had, when I run across a description of that day, September 25th, 63, in a book on the assassination, and it's already at that point 25 years later when I run across it, and the author quotes the speech, a few lines from the speech that Kennedy gave in North Dakota that day. And then I went to the speech and saw that those sentences were there. Tells me that the book has some veracity. It was a random sentence or two in the book that described the fact that it's referred to as the committee. The committee was still stalking Kennedy, or at least now that Richard Case Nagel had managed to derail the assassination attempt on the 20th of September, 5 days before I saw Kennedy. That linkage is probably the basis of the motivation I have to keep digging. Now, a lot of people have dismissed Richard Case Nagel as a crackpot, but Dick Russell didn't. And really, he and I have collaborated at various points. And he says, "You're onto something, keep going." So I have. When you have somebody like that, that is a master investigative reporter, I'll call him, you do what he suggests, right? And you see, when Nagel got arrested, he had lost contact with his handler in El Paso. Now, this, stop me or interrupt if you know some of this scenario, but apparently Richard Case, Nagel, and Oswald had been in a anti-Castro cell in New Orleans in the summer of '63, and it's portrayed in the movie JFK by Oliver Stone. And let's see, the scenario shows them sitting there, and Oswald is wiping his brow. He's stressed out because he's listening to the characters in the movie scene talking about killing Kennedy. I mean, they're just really vociferous. They want Kennedy dead, and we're going to do it. And now there's no indication whether one of the characters is Nagel in that room. It's about Oswald. So Nagel has this in the back of his mind. This meeting is in August. Now he's a double agent, and the Russians tell him they've discovered a plot to kill Kennedy, and that they know that the Joint Chiefs of Staff is going to frame the Russians in order to justify an attack on Cuba. Now, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis had already happened a year earlier. And so either this was going to be another attempt, because they were foiled the first time and blamed it on Kennedy. But Nagel is ordered by the Russians as a double agent to make his way to Mexico City to assassinate Oswald, who was supposed to be in Mexico City on the 26th. And that's always been a conundrum for me. If they were going to kill Oswald in North Dakota on the 25th, why was Oswald headed for Mexico City if he was going to be the patsy? Could be there was another patsy, or he didn't go to Mexico like a lot of people are saying now. But when Nagel got himself arrested by robbing a bank in El Paso on the 20th, he did it with the intent of derailing the plot that was going to be the assassination on the 24th, 25th, or 26th, someplace in there. When I realized I'm watching Kennedy on September 25th, and I see that in Russell's book, boy, the wheels start turning, right? And Nagel goes to jail subsequently after he gets arrested in this fake robbery. He walks into the bank in El Paso, and he says, I lost contact with my handler just as I was going to cross the border into Mexico. I smelled a rat. So he walks into the bank and puts 3 bullets, I think it was 3 bullets, into the wall or ceiling behind the tellers, and walks out and sits down in his car that's kind of right outside the bank, apparently. Now, other people say no, he walked and ran for 3 blocks and that kind of thing. Maybe so, but at any rate, his intent was to derail the assassination that he believed was coming in a few days. So here I walk through these 4 doors, and there's no security except there's a sharpshooter on the roof, hundreds of cops, local, campus police, FBI, Secret Service, state police. I didn't see them at the time, but subsequently discovered that they were surrounding this arena, and they knew that he was being stalked. And so they were trying to derail it. Now, the night before he had stayed overnight in Duluth, Minnesota. And I talked to the people in charge of security there, say in about 1998, and they said this place was tight as a drum. Nobody could get in, and it was in an arena at the University of Minnesota Duluth.
But two teenagers could get in.
Yeah, yeah. The next day. Okay. The previous night, apparently they couldn't, according to the people in charge of security. So, you know, and the plot thickens. You got any thing you want to interject at this point, or?
No, the Mexico and the New Orleans aspect of Oswald's character have been two areas it's so confusing. People are back and forth. I've heard people say that he was never in Mexico. I know people said he was in Mexico. I've only seen a document that states that J. Edgar Hoover said Oswald was not in Mexico. I've also seen other documents where Avardo, some agent, Nicaraguan agent, talked about Oswald was given money to assassinate Kennedy. And they proved he was lying. So it's just like, that's where a lot of the area of confusion is for me. I didn't really know what he was doing in New Orleans. The only thing I've ever really heard about him being involved in New Orleans was I think he got arrested and for starting a fight or something like that, or a fight that happened. And then I know about Ruth Payne's visit with Marina Oswald up to New Orleans. And on the way back, she made a mail transfer, but instead of transferring it to the new address in New Orleans, she decided to transfer it to Ruth Payne's house. And at this time, Ruth Payne or Marina Oswald didn't know how to write English, couldn't even speak English that well. So Ruth Payne obviously had to help Marina file that mail transfer. And I think at this point they were living together for a little bit. So she probably liked having Marina there and the kids and everything. So more of my knowledge probably boils down into the book depository building. So I'm very interested in learning more about this, the Mexico and New Orleans stuff as well, too.
Yeah. And the New Orleans part of it, I can say more about at some point. I was marooned down there during COVID for about 4 months. My son lived there. He just moved back a few months ago.
Did you get any beads?
Oh yeah, yeah. But actually, my knee infection started there, and I'd had a cortisone shot, and so I couldn't walk. Luckily, I didn't walk in any of the parades because COVID was taken off at that point in New Orleans, and so I dodged that bullet. And at any rate, during the time I've spent visiting my son over the last 10, 12 years in New Orleans, I've discovered quite a few things that relate to the wider assassination issues. So I can touch on that later. But so anyway, I don't find out that I should say I'm 15, 3 years later, I become a student at the University of North Dakota. And during the time frame of, let's say, 65, when I start as a student, through 69 when I graduate, the number of people coming through nationwide through university campuses to talk about their belief that there was a conspiracy allows me to connect my experience from 2000 or from 1963 pretty quickly in the late 60s, when I'm listening to these various researchers, everybody from Dick Gregory and others whose names are more obscure, but were some of the early researchers who were quite brilliant and accomplished scholars. And so pretty quickly after 63, my own awareness of what happened in 63 when I'm 15 years old started to accelerate. And I started reading everything I could get my hands on and trying to make sense out of it. And so that's basically the milieu within which I started to try to understand what had happened. And when Kennedy was killed 2 months after I saw him speak and had the best seat in the House, was, I wasn't that political or conscious whether I liked Kennedy or not. And so, but it was such a traumatic event for everybody that it stuck with me to be watching the proceedings of those 3 days, Friday through Sunday, when Oswald was killed. And one thing has led to another. I mean, I've traveled all over the country, trying to, whether it be New Orleans or Minneapolis, New York, to try and put the pieces together. And I'm at the point where I'm trying to pull the trigger on writing a book. And the thing is, you got to get past the idea that if you write a book, it has to be 200, 300, 400 pages. There are lots of books of 100 pages that are worth looking at. And, but it's like, you got to get past these various barriers to actually writing, and not just spin your wheels by thinking, gee, how am I going to come up with 300 pages of material? Maybe I can, but it's
I think with
not
the
that.
Kennedy assassination, you could probably write way more than 300 pages.
Yeah, people are doing it, seems like, every day. I mean, you've been to Dealey Plaza, I assume?
Mm-mm.
Okay. Well, when you get there, you will find on the first floor of the depository a library. You go in the front door that everybody has seen from pictures, take an immediate left, and there is a room that has all 2,000 plus books on the assassination. And you can't check them out, but they have all kinds of things archived. They archived my story a couple of years ago, maybe 5 years ago now. And so they have 2,000 people talking about where they were that day, what their experience was. And of course, they're trying to capture a lot of the people that were in Dealey Plaza in case they might say something significant. So I wasn't there, but I was in another place where it may have been going to happen and didn't. So, the obscure place that I was at on September 25th, 63 is obscure, I think, to a lot of people, and not significant because it's not Chicago, Tampa, Los Angeles. People have a bias. They don't think that something like this could happen anyplace.
Well, people disregard the other assassination attempts. People talk about that there were no prior assassination attempts and there was only one in Dallas, but we know that's not true. Um, and it gets hard because it's like, how do you debate what we can, I mean, the Secret Service destroyed a bunch of stuff. They destroyed death threats. They destroyed a bunch of things. And that's useful information to validate the attempts on Kennedy's life as well, too. And Vince Palomaro, who's done a book on the Secret Service, and, he's interviewed all those Secret Service guys. I mean, that's the weirdest thing to me. That, I mean, if I was you, and what it took away is, what are the Secret Service looking for? How could they be so lax on the doors or security, but then also be prevailing the crowd, expecting, like, is there a shooter in the crowd or something like that? I mean, they had to be aware, but at the same time, when you hear interviews and you hear the relationship Kennedy had with his Secret Service members, and a lot of them despise whether it was affairs and things of this sort, I think it puts it in a little bit more of like, okay, well, someone's at fault, and it might be a group effort in this aspect. And, we got to make sure, that's known, at least if it's true.
Exactly. Yeah, when I would teach about the assassination at Kennedy High School, at least I'd even teach it in psychology class. I would teach it in world history, US history. I'd knock out a week and a half of time where I would try to get the students interested, and I'd try to be balanced. I even use some of Posner's information in terms of the magic bullet and so on. And so that allowed me teaching at Kennedy High School to pursue what had happened to me in 63, right? And I was very fortunate that way to have had the experience in 63 and then be able to be in a position to teach young students a part of their history, and I would always tell them, I've got 5,000 books in my library here. And some people say, well, have you read them all? Well, of course I haven't read them all. I don't, and I would tell my students, I don't buy a book unless it has an index so that I can use it as a reference. And, I've got a couple hundred books on the assassination. Um, I let my wife, the English teacher, read the novels, and I get my fiction from going to movies. I put it that way, but she keeps me up to speed on stuff she's reading. But actually, being married soon, so from 1973 till now, it was in 75 when I had my first teaching job out in rural Minnesota that I came home one day from work and she throws me Mark Lane's uh, book on Rush to Judgment, said, read, and she said, you better read this. Well, that's why I say she has been a supporter of allowing me to go to conferences. And, I haven't had to spend a lot of money, but I don't make any money for sure. And I'm not looking to make money off of any of my JFK activity. At most you could say, well, you were paid as a teacher and you taught about Kennedy. So in effect, you were paid. Well, I suppose.
Well, you're paying me right now with $1 million worth of value right now. Because, like I said, this is a topic I think for me that's very interesting, and you probably see it in your students that get interested into it once they start learning a lot about just the issues that are going on. I mean, I bring up the example: would Oswald, if he made it to a trial, would he have gotten a fair one? I mean, at that point, he was in trial by media, newspapers and memos back and forth between Katzenbach and Hoover, and everyone else was already talking about that Oswald was the assassin. Even if he would have made it to a thing, would it have been a fair trial? I mean, you learn about all the perjury that goes on in trials. There's a little bit of perjury in Watergate, whether you agree with the decision or not. There's perjury with the Manson trial with Vincent Bugliosi, who also wrote about the JFK assassination. You get into a lot of weird aspects where it's like, was the law is just? And we know the law is corrupt now. So obviously there's been no improvement or no change. So you get into this aspect of, would Oswald have made it to a fair trial? Would he have gotten the answer that he was the assassin officially, or would he have gotten, you know, free? I bring up the example I think a lot of people do is the backyard photographs. There's three things incriminating him, which when you say it like that, it's like, holy, yeah, that is true. It's a weird thing. It's like taking a photo with a beer, but also like taking a photo with a beer. You have to ask the aspect of, does that mean you drove home? Do I assume you drove home from a photograph because you had a beer in your hand? No, I don't. So can you assume that the man killed the president because he's got a rifle, a pistol, and the rifle doesn't match the one that they found? When you start talking it out, and I think in a normal law proceeding, if that would have came out, there would have been like, that makes a lot of sense. And you start bringing in witnesses. Roger Craig's a good example. He had many attempts on his life as well too, and the whole area gets really murky. I mean, that's why I think Penn Jones gave the best explanation to researchers, which is find one thing and research the hell out of it, because there is so much, and it's been going on for a while. I think prior assassination plots are a good example of, hey, there's probably going to be another one. So be on your lookout. And then it falls down on the Secret Service and many other aspects.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think you're doing a great job, uh, as young as you are, getting up to speed uh, by spending as much time as you are and actually interviewing people. I really admire that.
I got 2
And
months under my belt. Give me some more time.
yeah, yeah. um, you know, speaking of how I guess you mentioned in some aspect the media confusing the issue. Like you know something about Life magazine's involvement, I'm sure.
Yeah, I talked to Mal Hyman who mentioned him, and I know they bought the Zapruder film, um, and stored that away too. But Life Magazine to me seems like a shell company. I don't know what it is, and I know about the 1035 document saying label all things as conspiracy theories, going against any new evidence on the Warren Commission. But Life magazine was so powerful back then. I had to understand how big of a scope of that thing it was. And they were involved in a lot of things. I mean, before the rise of independent media or independent news, underground news articles that were protesting the Vietnam War and writing about that. I mean, Life magazine's still there, still the main focus, and not talking about any of these serious issues. It wasn't until Martin Luther King, when he was assassinated, that when buildings were being burned and all this was going on, that they finally decided to make a public statement about some of these things. So Life magazine is something, when you see that and you see the articles of whatever old copies now, I mean, they publish Lee Harvey on the front holding up those papers. And if I'm not mistaken, when the Warren Report came out, or if the Warren Reporter Commission, there was like a 2-hour documentary that also came out around the same time. Like, it was too quick, where it was like, were you guys already working on that while they were working on their report? Like, you didn't wait for an official investigation to properly do some time. And, that brings in, okay, more media manipulation. I know about J. Edgar Hoover invading Hollywood looking for communists. And, there's many other aspects. They were invading the Black Panther Party and so much more. So it doesn't seem super crazy. And then you see Hoover's name pop up also with Kennedy. So
Right, right. Well, I'll describe my experience with Life magazine now. In fact, it relates to North Dakota's dimension in the whole thing. In 1927, a man graduated at 16 years old from the University of North Dakota. Now, some people would laugh and say, well, yeah, sure. It'd be easy to graduate from a university in North Dakota. They probably only required 10 hours of coursework or so. Well, no, North Dakota gets a bad rap in terms of its nationwide reputation. It's cold and people leave and so on. But a guy named Edward K. Thompson grew up about 60 miles north of the University of North Dakota, and he was a child prodigy. He became the editor at Life magazine. He micromanaged 600 consecutive issues. He was in charge of the backyard photo and the Zapruder film. Nobody knows about this guy. All they do is they talk about C.D. Jackson, publisher, and the owner, Henry Luce, as being CIA. Well, here's how things happen in such an uncanny way. Since I graduated in 69, 50 years ago, I've been getting an alumni review as an ex-graduate of the University of North Dakota. One day in about 1998 or 9, I'm looking at the magazine, the alumni review, and here's a picture of 5 big-time bankers that graduated from North Dakota and were Wall Street bankers. One was actually named John Hancock. And I had seen this story before about these 5 banker graduates. But there was one guy in the picture I had no idea the identity of, and it was a guy named Edward K. Thompson. And he was identified as a editor at Life magazine. And of course, I've already looked into Life magazine's suspicious behavior with the film and so on, but I didn't know any of the players at Life magazine. So this is 1998. You could still call your alumni center and say, look, I'm looking for a graduate from 1927. By chance, do you have contact information for a guy named Edward K. Thompson? They gave it to me. No questions asked. And my only takeaway is it's that they want to keep alumni in touch because you might be able to convince your fellow graduate, if they became a millionaire, to give $1 million to the university. So he was dead. He had died in 1995, I think, at 95 years old. They said, "Do you want his wife's phone number?" Sure. I call her up. And at this point, not being a professional investigative journalist, I had to make some pretty weak stuff up. And I told her I was writing a book about famous North Dakotans. And there's a lot of them. Like any state, has a lot of people that go on to be notable. And I got her on the phone, and her name was Lee Eitengon. And here's a book, The Eitengons. And it's subtitled A 20th Century Story. Well, when I told her I was doing a story on famous North Dakotans, including her husband, I said, or she said, "Are you going to be in New York anytime?" Now she's a widow, she's alone, living up by Chappaqua, north of the city. And I think at that point I had already gotten funding from the University of Minnesota, even though I wasn't a graduate, to pay some, plane ticket, and they found me a place to stay with another professor. And I go out there, and this is 1999. And she says, "Call me when you get here, so I know you've actually arrived." So I get there, and it's July 3rd of 99. And she says, "Well, I'm going to have to beg off for a day or two because I've got family obligations tomorrow, the 4th, obviously, July 4th. And so I go to the Strand bookstore in Midtown Manhattan, and I start scouring the shelves for books on Life magazine. And there's a whole section. I couldn't believe it. And I find reference to her as being a second wife of Edward K. Thompson, and she was a fellow traveler of the US Communist Party. I thought, wait a minute, I'm in over my head here. Well, I spend the 2 days, doing as much research as I could before I go up. I go to Grand Central Station, jump on a train, head up to where she lives in north of Chappaqua. That's the only name I can remember from her location. But we went to lunch at her country club. Well, she picks me up at the train station, and she said, "I'll be driving a red little foreign station wagon." So I knew her right away. And I get in the car, and the first thing she says is, "Your friend Stuart said you don't care whether we eat Chinese or American." And I freeze. How does she know where I'm staying? Well, I had given her a phone number, but she didn't call me.
Why did she ask the question if you didn't care if you eat American or Chinese? Is she checking to see if you're anti-communist?
I to this day, I don't know, but when I
The
left,
reason I say that is because that's like a question where it's like, "Oh, I'll take Chinese food." Like, you're a communist. I don't know if it's something simple like that.
well, it turns out she was too sophisticated. And so I discovered later that the guy that I was staying with, a guy named Stuart Gallinor, who actually has a book on the assassination, she called because I had given her my number. I had to give her a phone number in case something came up, and she's in her 70s at that point. Maybe she got sick, and so he told me later, "Oh yeah, she called and asked whether you cared whether you ate Chinese or American." Well, that was just a dummy question to find out who I was staying with, because I'd just given her a number with no name of the owner of the number, right? One son was a CIA agent, the other was The other son was the publisher of Reader's Digest. Talk about somebody that is probably anti-communist, right? So at any rate, she lets me sit there and listen to her talk for 6 straight hours. And she lets me record. And I'm not saying anything about the assassination because I don't know that she kind of knows why I'm there. As it turns out, I'm there because she now knows who I was staying with, who was a Kennedy researcher, right? And so I've just got to let her talk. And at about 3 hours in, she says, "Do you want to see Ed, my husband's retirement party at Life magazine?" I said, "Sure, be great." Well, I was there because I thought maybe I was going to be able to get her to give me the original copy of the Zapruder film because her husband had control of it from day one as the editor at Life. And, she leaves the room a few times and I'm looking around, where could that thing be? I'm not going to get up and start opening cupboard doors and so on, but we go into her bedroom.
So you're looking for snacks. I don't know.
Yeah, right. So we go into her bedroom and she gets onto the bed and I sit down 5 feet away and she puts the tape of his retirement party on. And about 11 minutes in, the narrator, who is somebody at Life magazine, said, "Ed finally arrived. He was hobnobbing with presidents." And it shows him walking down the street in this 15-minute video with Truman. Now remember, he micromanaged 600 consecutive issues of Life, every cover, including the backyard photo. So at the 11-minute mark, when the narrator says Ed had finally arrived, at that moment, there were 3 what I call simulated gunshots superimposed on that piece of tape. Sounded like kind of. And I turned to her and I said, "What was that?" It was like she was in a trance. She says, "I don't know." Now she was there at the retirement party. And I said, "Can I record that?" She says, "Sure." So I got up. Now back up a little bit. The night before, I called my wife and I said, "Nobody's pushed me off a subway platform yet. Don't worry about me." And my wife says, out of the blue, she doesn't know why to this day she said it. She says, "You're going to get something, but it isn't going to be the Zapruder film. It's going to be something unexpected."
I thought she was going to ask, like, I know you don't care, but do you want Chinese or American?
Yeah. Very good. So anyway, I get up and I have my tape recorder and set it down next to the speaker on the TV. She gets off the bed, walks over, and here's a stack of tapes right next to the TV. Had to be 50 of them in 2 different stacks. In the middle of the pile, she pulls one out. And she says, "Here's a duplicate. You can have it," of his retirement party with the 3 shots superimposed. Now, I mean, this, you're into it to the point where this is obvious to you, I'm sure. The assassination had to stay at 3 shots. There couldn't be a 4th. Otherwise, there's a conspiracy. So he successfully implicated Oswald with the picture on the cover with the rifle. But it was almost like, and this is conjecture, but with what's going on at Life magazine at the time doesn't surprise me, that those 3 shots were symbolic of his instrumental activity in keeping the scenario at 3 shots. Ed had finally arrived. Boom, boom, boom. "Yes, you can record those," she says. Now, she wasn't going to be disloyal, is how I read it, to her husband. She was just going to give me some leads that could implicate Life magazine. Now, she said the thing that her and her husband disagreed about most was the Vietnam War. She was a leftist. She was a Marxist. Her father was put in prison by Stalin and Lenin because he was starting to waffle on providing money to the revolution in 1917 by not coughing up a lot of the money that he made controlling the fur trade in Siberia. He was a millionaire by around the time of the assassination. He migrated to New York City, emigrated to New York City. She grows up in that milieu. And the family, her family was instrumental in having Leon Trotsky assassinated in Mexico City in 1939. Another coincidence, I've lived where I am now in suburban Minneapolis for 32 years, and a good friend of mine, his father was the bodyguard for Leon Trotsky the day he was assassinated in Mexico City. So these unbelievable connections continue to arise. And in some sense, they don't mean anything, but it's like 6 degrees of separation is really a thing.
I mean, if they got all these connections, they must have a damn good phone plan, because I've never in my life have I come across more connections and more coincidence than in the Kennedy assassination. I mean, the guy who shot John Lennon at the doorman at that hotel was involved in the Bay of Pigs. So it's like,
Really, I didn't know that.
what that's from John Potash, who did a book called CIA Weapons Against Us, which is about influencing musicians. But I mean, I came across documents with Life magazine where there's a reporter that went down and picked up Marina, picked up the mother, and picked up the 2 children, went to the Adolphus Hotel, used a fake name called Joe Rubenstein, and refused to let anybody see the kids. And then later the FBI got there and took Marina and the kids and the mother away. But I'm like, why is Life magazine involved in this? Why is it a reporter that goes, you could say, to get the scoop before everybody else? Well, no one had power like Life magazine. It wasn't just about getting a scoop. There was something else involved in there, a little bit of collusion.
Yes. Well, Mr. Thompson, who's confused a lot of times with Tink Thompson, who was also
6 Seconds in Dallas.
Yeah, he was also privy to a lot of the stuff at Life magazine, but he's not the Thompson here that, in my mind, is even more relevant, because I have a picture of him that is actually on the back or inside cover of an issue of the Fourth Decade, which is a journal out of the University of New York, Fredonia. A guy named Jerry Rose used to run conferences there or wherever. And that picture shows Ed Thompson over a light table with a colleague. And there's no way, I don't think there's any way you can see what they're looking at, but the implication is that they're dealing with frames of the Zapruder film. They're blowing them up, they're eliminating frames. Thompson says when there's a frame missing, he says, oh, the tech dropped it and it split. All kinds of bullshit like that. And when Lee Rankin, who was second to the Earl Warren on the Warren Commission, I've got memos coming from Rankin to Thompson at Life magazine saying, I've asked you 3 times for the original backyard photo. When are you going to get it to me? The 4th time, he threatens Thompson, have it to me by 4:30 on, I don't know, it was in April probably. And Thompson finally coughs it up and says, oh, I touched up the backyard photo. I did some stuff around his leg, around his shoulder, around the butt of the rifle. I call that a limited hangout. Now, get this. Thompson was hired in, I believe it was 1939, by Henry Luce, the owner of Time Life, right? And Thompson had left North Dakota after he graduated, went to a weekly paper in North Dakota. He soon graduated to the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and as their photo person. He sees the first issue of Life magazine in 1939 and he says, I can do better than this with their photos. So he applies. He's a stringer at that point for Time. So he's in the loop. He's not totally obscure to Henry Luce. Well, while he was at the Journal or the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, perfected compositing pictures for newspapers. He says, I can do better with your pictures at Life magazine. They hire him. Master compositor. Even describes how he makes the cut lines. He cuts at an angle, which seems fairly simple, but it's done in such a way that the cut lines disappear. Well, does that mean Oswald's head is on somebody else's body? That's what Oswald said. But if we didn't have this Edward K. Thompson talking about actually altering the photo and being the master compositor at Life magazine, there wouldn't be much to talk about. But
It's better than my theory.
and so that blew me away.
I thought Oswald might have manipulated the photos himself. Speaking with Bart, who focused on Oswald's 48 hours in that interrogation where he says, that's me, but that's not, like, that's my face, but that's not me. And I looked at his background at the Stovall Company, and people said he wasn't there long enough to really do anything. I go, well, people have said he created the AJ Heidel ID. He made that little fake ID. And I go, he also has a photo, and there's many backyard photographs, but there's one specifically given to George de Mohrenschildt that says Hunter a Fascist on the back. And I go, I know people bring up Roscoe White as the person in the photo, but I mean, like I said, the photographs, I've dived in a little bit, but that's not like my best points or anything on that. But I just go, I mean, how much do you expect? It's like today where, I mean, I'm 24, manipulate a photo, put a Photoshop someone's face. I mean, the technology is obviously different, but I mean, that photo with Hunter a Fascist on the back given to George de Mohrenschildt, I mean, he's bragging to his friend who he knows is like deep in like this, well, not deep in the CIA, but in the CIA, like as connected individual. And I just go, he's trying to seem cool. The Oswald loner angle, I never got. There's just many depictions of him, and there's plenty of documents to state that he was obviously not stupid in any way. Loner, maybe, but to say he's an idiot or just some nut, I don't believe that. There's no really evidence to prove that. I mean, the Patsy angle in the interviews, he looked like he was probably waiting for someone to get him out of this mess that he's now in. I mean, you would be shouting your innocence if you didn't think anybody was coming to help you. There was questions that were asked him that he looked surprised. That doesn't look like a glory hog trying to get the credit for killing the president. I mean, if you do the act and, you want to get the credit for it, especially if you're about to be sent to jail. But his last words were he didn't do it. So, I mean, it just opens up a whole doorway of like I said, my theory about him manipulating his own photographs. I don't know. I think that's could be plausible in a sense. He was way too quick. He said, wait till this comes out in court. It'll see it's not me. Okay, well, he was pretty damn sure it wasn't him. So either he wasn't in that photo, but I mean, was he in the backyard? And then you got to trust Marina Oswald, but I would just suggest throwing her out as a witness in general, even if he changed her statement to the conspiracy side. It's too flimsy to last in court.
Exactly. Yeah. In Thompson's autobiography, which I became aware of after interviewing his wife, he describes his relationship with Henry Luce, the owner. And he says Henry Luce says that he's a fascist. He believes in fascism. And Thompson says, and I think I do too. So here we have two fascists, one budding, the other working for someone who's, an avowed fascist based on, and I always say this, fascism doesn't need gas chambers and war. Well, it needs war, but it doesn't need gas chambers. And so the fact that Henry Luce says the reason I'm a fascist is I think that successful businessmen should be running the country. And that, to me, says a lot about how easy it is to become what's called friendly fascism or pinstripe fascism, along the model of Wall Street, dictating foreign policy and so on, and the military industrial complex having its way with the Defense Department, et cetera.
It's crazy to me how people will call it a conspiracy when you just look at a strategic thing where if you have a source, a media outlet or media outlets that are printing out a message that the public is going to see, wouldn't it just be easier to be friends with the people that run these media outlets? It's not super, it doesn't even need to enter the words of deep politics or anything like that. It's just how messages, I mean, it took me a while to come to grips with this, but when you learn about J. Edgar Hoover invading Hollywood, and you realize that every movie you've seen, and anybody out there listening will know this when I say it, when the FBI comes on screen, you think, oh, the badasses are here. The people that are, nobody messes with them. That's the elite task force. Okay. Well, that's been programmed India because there's influences, and not just our government, but all governments into scripts. I mean, when we decided to make Pearl Harbor, we had to talk to Japan about that. We had to, is this okay? They let us take, they told us to take some things out. They didn't want to seem like they were beat that bad. And there's many contradictions, obviously, depending on where you fall on Japan and America. But when it came to Pearl Harbor specifically, there was a scene in the movie where, as someone was talking on the ship, a person got basically blown to smithereens in the background. And they were like, cut that. And that's not in the original, that's not in the film when it went up. They had influence in that script. And that's with most motion pictures. I mean, Batman's a good example. This rogue superhero, who is he tied to? Commissioner Gordon, because someone has to be attached to authority. And now it's more simple to understand it when I explain it in that sense. So just bring it to the example of being involved in newspapers and media outlets and this overall hunt. I mean, Timothy Leary, for instance, the king of LSD, Nixon's hunt and war against him. I mean, they were really worried about activists and all these types of new cultures that were threatening this area of what they labeled domestic terrorism. So that deep state talk, I think, is very real. I believe in it, but people always go, oh, that's conspiracy, like Illuminati stuff. I'm like, okay, well, let's put it in less flashy terms and more common ones, which is just a smart strategic advantage. You capture your media outlets and you make sure that they spin the message when you tell them, hey, we'll give you exclusives. We'll give you this if you do what we say. Okay.
Sure. Yep. I mean, anybody that disses it that way needs to read Peter Dale Scott, and he's got it all articulated. It's amazing.
He talks about Vietnam, which I want to get a good aspect on. Is I think we're in Vietnam for heroin, to be 100% honest with you. I know people say that's conspiracy talk, but I'm like, I've talked to plenty of soldiers on this show that talk about guarding poppy fields for no specific reason as why to do so. And I think that's strange.
Yeah, right. The I keep going back to, you find a niche where you can develop some expertise. And of course, in my case, it's around Minnesota, North Dakota, where I've had coincidences happen. And Clint Hill, for example, grew up in my hometown, Grand Forks. And I've talked to him a couple of times, and I don't get anything out of him, but at any rate, it's like, what's in your backyard that you still haven't discovered? So you might as well focus, like what's his name down in Texas said, focus on one topic and run with it, right? Like you mentioned earlier. Well, in Thompson's case, he was in up to his neck, and his wife that I interviewed was on the plane headed for Tokyo when Kennedy was assassinated. And she even mentioned that the code book went missing. Now, she was on the plane because her husband was being courted by Dean Rusk, who I guess was the Secretary of State, and maybe he was also Defense Secretary. He was trying to recruit Ed Thompson to be the ambassador to Greece during the Greek junta of right-wing generals. And she told me, there we are sitting in a hotel lobby in Athens, and my husband Ed is with Rusk and these generals in a conference room. And he comes out, walks over to me, and I said, Ed, we do not belong here. And he didn't take the ambassadorship to Greece because she was beginning to get to him. He even said in his autobiography, I wish I had understood more about Marxism. Well, that's his wife. He wished he had understood her more because she was bringing that to the marriage via her father, who was in prison in the Soviet Union. So she had, just a wide amount of experience, but she still wasn't going to be disloyal to him. But she was going to tell me enough so that I could, follow the tangents. There's a guy named James Wagenvord. Have you run across that name?
Yeah.
He just died a month or two ago.
I didn't know he died.
Yeah, I just found out a couple of weeks ago. Well, he told me the story about he worked on the floor below where Luce and Thompson had their offices next door to each other. And he said the day before he was in charge of disseminating pictures of Oswald to the foreign press, as you may know. And he said one day he goes up to Thompson's office, and Dulles, not John Fox, what's the other one?
Alan
Dulles was in the office, and Thompson says, cut a check for $3,000 for Alan. Now, this is after he'd been fired by Kennedy, right? And so Wagenvord says, normally it would take a day or two to cut a check for somebody. I did it immediately and it worked. So Dulles, that's one more piece of evidence that Dulles was working for a CIA front called Life magazine. And at any rate, that made it even more likely that Thompson was much more into it. And that's why it's hard to understand how nobody knows about him, because C.D. Jackson and Luce take precedence. Well, 45 years after the assassination, I'm up in North Dakota visiting my mother, and I pick up the local paper, and there's a story about that day in '63. And now I'm in 93, 30, it was about 2000. And here's a story celebrating Kennedy's visit to the University of North Dakota to get an honorary degree. And in the story, it says the professor at the University of North Dakota that was in charge of security that day says this about that day. Now, I knew the guy. He lived 2 blocks from my mother. My brothers and sisters played with his kids. I had never met him. I was surrounded in my neighborhood by professors. My parents neither of them had finished high school. They were blue collar, but we were surrounded by these professors. So I had these kinds of connections. Well, the person in charge of security, John Penn, was a debate coach at the University of North Dakota, and he had been asked by the university administration to orchestrate Kennedy's visit. So the reporter says, what is something funny from that day? Describe the scene. Well, of course, he didn't know about me going through 4 doors until I told him a few weeks later. But he said in this article, he says, yeah, he said, I'd forgotten to give the university president his credentials that would allow him to escort JFK into the arena from his limo parked outside the back big door that trucks could go through and so on. And he said, I got the message somehow. They didn't have cell phones, so somehow he got the message that he needed to get to the door to give the university president, who I knew from delivering his paper as a kid. And he said, I had to run across the arena to get his credentials so that Kennedy could come in. Now here's Kennedy cooling his heels, standing next to the limo for quite a few minutes until Dr. Penn got the credentials for the university president delivered. 100 yards away, if that, was a football stadium with towers. And, you know, this is total conjecture on my part, that could it be that when Nagel discovered that there was to be an assassination on the 25th, so he gets himself thrown in jail, is this in fact a busted plot because he gets thrown in jail, but the plotters are still there monitoring security to see if they could have gotten further with the plot. And they take notes about what went wrong, whether it's what went wrong with Nagel or what went wrong with, but my contention is that this man in charge of security, this professor, who when I interviewed him in 2000 was about 90 years old, but still very lucid. And I meet him, I call him up after I see the story in the paper about his time that day orchestrating security. I said, you know, on the phone, I said, I got to talk to you. Those 4 doors were open. Can you help me understand why, since you were in charge of security? He says, well, maybe the custodians left them open. Well, because I come to visit my mother, I go back 2 months later and I call him again. He says, okay, let's meet again at the Ramada Inn restaurant. So we do. I said, have you thought any more about why those doors were open? He says, well, those doors should have been locked. I gave the keys to the Secret Service that morning at 7:30. They should have been locked when you went through the doors at 10:30. Okay. We make small talk. I come back 2 months later. This time he says, let's go to my apartment, which was right next to campus. So I show up, knock on the door. He opens the door and he says, come on in, but sit down right here. And he's pulled 2 dining room chairs to in a position right next to the door. You know, yeah, they could have been there, but they should have been in the dining room. As I sit down, he sits down next to me and leans over and says to me, you don't think I was involved, do you? Now, if I had been a master investigative reporter, I would have known how to proceed, I think. But what I said was, oh no, Dr. Penn. And I thought, okay, then subsequently, I've processed this to think, okay, he forgot to give the university president credentials so that Kennedy is stuck outside where I mean, there were sharpshooters on the roof. It's not clear there wasn't an angle for one of the sharpshooters to shoot him from another part of the roof, right? Because it had jogs in it. Well, that was the right answer. If I'd given the wrong answer, yeah, I think you're involved. He had me right by the door, and even though he was 90, could have made an attempt to shove me out the door for accusing him of being involved, which I had never done. So that was the end of it. He would never, and I would run into him, he would avoid me so that it couldn't come up again, that I couldn't ask any further questions. Now, he described to me meeting with the movers and shakers at that same Ramada Inn restaurant in a conference room over the years. And just 3 months ago, an old girlfriend, not really, but I had a date with her once. She saw that I had this research about September 25th, 63. And she says, you know, the summer of 63, my father, a very successful dentist, had 2 millionaire farmers who had originated in Minneapolis, but went 300 miles north to the Red River Valley on the North Dakota-Minnesota border and made their millions farming. And she said, that night in the summer of 63, I heard them say, somebody has to kill Kennedy sooner than later. And my dad said, Nikki, you need to go upstairs. I don't want you here when so-and-so, when another man comes to this meeting. Well, I knew the other man. And I told her, is that who it was? And she says, yeah. Well, he was an even richer farmer, but he was the financer of the John Birch Society in the Midwest. And so were these 2 other millionaires. I was good friends with their kids. I played hockey with them in high school. So I knew the turf, so to speak. And at the time, I didn't know they were hardcore Birchers. And so it didn't fall into place really until 2-3 months ago when this gal sees my research and she says, this happened to me that summer. Now, my friend that went through those 4 doors with me, he told me about his father's relationship to H.L. Hunt, the Texas oil man. And he dropped out of the university about 1967. He's in the Army, he's in the Navy. I become the surrogate son for his father, who is the friend of H.L. Hunt. And we're sitting in the backyard in 68. My father had died in 65. So maybe he thought I was wiser going through the death of a parent and had figured some things out. And we're sitting in the backyard. He's divorced, so he's alone. He needs somebody to talk to. But he's the state petroleum engineer. And he told me that he would meet with H.L. Hunt out in the oil fields in western North Dakota one night in a Holiday Inn. And he said, I was trying to get Hunt to do paperwork to lease drilling land. And all Hunt would want to do is talk about killing Kennedy. So finally, I left his room and went down the hall to my room, and he was legally blind by 60, 62. And so there he is ranting about killing Kennedy. I can hear him as I go down the hallway to my room. And he finally says, LBJ did it. I knew nothing about that. I don't know if it had occurred to me. This is 1968. But the fact that he was that close, he'd go to Dallas and go to dinner at Hunt's house. And my friend who breached security with me, when I would relate this stuff to him when he came back from the Navy, he'd meet me in Dallas sometimes. He'd come in from Wichita Falls where he lived, and he would come to the hotel where the conference might be, and I would say, this is what your dad said. And I can remember a couple of times he leaned over, closed his eyes, and shuddered. He died 6 months ago. And I think he knew more. I think his dad had made him privy to more about what was going on between all these. I mean, Hunt's sons would show up in the geology department across the street from their arena where Kennedy gave his speech. And I talked to one geologist whose son I was good friends with. And I said, so this is what I'm thinking about the assassination. He says, well, you got to realize that whole geology department of petroleum people were to the right of Attila the Hun. He says, I was the only liberal in that department. And here Hunt's sons were showing up at that office. You know, so it's, again, it's the environment that I was spending time in, even though I had moved to Minneapolis I'd moved south in 75. So I've been gone 45 some years already, but I was back there all the time. And so I had opportunities to put these little pieces together that in my mind verify what Richard Case Nagel was talking about, even though he had no clue that that Kennedy was going on this conservation tour. So I'll take a breath there. And
You've given me enough, man. I got some more research I got to be doing on this aspect of things. Like I said, I'm interested in learning a lot about the assassination, every aspect, and there are many aspects to it. But you got to write a book, man. You got to write, at least do something with that. I mean, that's an interesting aspect and story. I mean, you've done some pretty good research, and I like that you focused specifically things that obviously are in your backyard. Um, I think that's important. I mean, I'm in Maryland. I think we got Bethesda Medical Center, maybe, but I don't have the clearance to get in there. But there's a lot of so many interesting things. But I really do appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show.
well,
Seriously.
let me tell you now. We're at an hour, I guess. So I was at a teachers convention in DC in about 2004 or 5. And I was pretty loyal to my teachers union to actually go to the meetings. But I had some time left after the last day. My wife and I went to the National Archives at the University of Maryland, right? And I knew that that's where a lot of the assassination material was. So we go in, I've got about 3 hours before it closes. They say, what do you want to see? I said, well, let me see the trip records from the Secret Service from September 25th, 63. And I think I just got lucky to remember to ask for those, because going in, I didn't know what the inside of the place looked like, how much security there was, et cetera. I mean, you have to get a security badge actually printed on the way in plastic. And they check every briefcase and so on. So they bring out this cart with boxes, file boxes on it. And my wife, who I've got along because she reads with more comprehension than I do, I think, being an English teacher, she reaches up for one of the boxes on the top of the cart. And it almost flips off the top. I thought, what the heck? I get up. There's 2 boxes. You can tell there's nothing in them. I take the covers off. Inside each one is a piece of paper that says withdrawn for national security reasons. September 25th, 63. And
Story of my life.
Yeah. So sometimes you don't find something and it says more about the situation than could possibly be. Well, I take that to John Tunheim here in Minneapolis, who's the ARRB,
He's been on the show before.
does he? Yeah, and maybe he mentioned this, but I told him. He says, yeah, he says 2 weeks before I asked for those documents from the Secret Service trip records from '63, I called them and asked why they hadn't turned them over. And their response was, well, we shredded those 2 weeks ago.
I know, it's crazy. It's like great
Did he?
timing, guys.
Yeah. Did he mention that by chance?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
I had to pull it out of him a little bit when I said you didn't come. I already knew about it. I was like, you didn't have any problems. And he was like, well, there was this time. And I was like, see, if I was not educated in that, then I wouldn't have even thought to ask that question.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I don't, he's a federal judge. He's way too busy to spend time, but we used to have a group here in the Twin Cities, that would invite speakers. This is starting about 20 years ago. We'd have him, I think we had him talk twice. And so I had a chance to bird dog a little bit about what happened to these documents. He says, well, I think they could be in another location where copies could be. And I don't know, could be, but certainly it was withdrawn for national security reasons. I don't know.
Suspicious.
Yeah.
Coincidence or suspicious or just great timing. I don't know. They can give a whole list of reasons that could explain it, but
What he mostly, did he tell you that what he thinks most about is the significance of the records and recordings from Mexico City? That's what he thinks is prime.
yeah, he thinks Oswald was in Mexico. I know that. I know he thinks Oswald did it as well too. And I told him, I was like, man, I'm just looking at stuff, and to say that there isn't one thing here that's just not out of the ordinary when it comes to investigation into the death of the president. And he agreed on that aspect. But I think most researchers that either believe something else is going on or something, they they just separate on small details, which I'm like, oh, you can't do that. You gotta get, like, I had an episode, and John Duncan commented, and he was like, Oswald didn't kill Tippit. And the guy I had on, just he laid out how the Warren Commission, the data didn't match any of this type of stuff. And he had that one mention of Oswald killing Tippit. We didn't talk about it a whole lot. We moved on. I don't believe it. I told him, I said, I don't think so. But it's those little details, the small little ones that just separate certain aspects of the community. I'm like, if we can all agree that there's conspiracy, depending on what variations of it, I think we can, come together a little bit and put some research effort together.
Right. How many people do you think you've had an opportunity to interview about the assassination?
At least 65 people.
Wow.
Yeah. Jim DiGino, Gary Aguilar, David Mantic, Paul Blow, Dale Myers, Gerald Posner. I spent all day listening. Gary Lee, Bart Camp, obviously, Rob Clark, Bob, Doug Campbell, a lot of people. We can talk a little bit more about it off air, obviously, but I'm interested. Like I said, I'm trying to talk to a lot of people, and people, at least, even like I even said, if I got Marina's phone number, I'd give her a call, even if she didn't want to be on air. I rather, just for my own sanity, try and hear her perspective of what she was dealing with. Because I think a lot of people were speculating for a while that Marina was muscled in with the idea of deportation. Is that why she gave testimony? Well, I found a document that says that's officially what she claimed, that she was afraid she was going to be deported. So it's not just ideas of speculation. She made public statements about that. And there's a FBI file that's her excuse. That's her example. In then you got J. Edgar Hoover giving the okay to, threaten the idea of deportation. You don't actually have to do it, just threaten it or toss it out there. And I'm like, okay, so that's true. And that's what I'm trying to do is, look at the documents. What do the documents say? The documents don't, Harold Weisberg, Malcolm Blunt, they have good archives to go through. But you've given me enough of your time, Gary. Is there a place where people can find your links, man? I really appreciate the time you gave me to talk today.
Well, I have a a blog that's very intermittent called Three Shots at Life, with life capitalized as the magazine. And I've got some interviews posted there with various people. And there's at Harvey and Lee, John Armstrong has some of my research posted. I forgot to mention that he kind of got me going too when I inadvertently saw a magazine in downtown Minneapolis about 1990 about the possibility of there being two Oswalds, and it was in Dallas Monthly, I think, and Mrs. Connolly was on the cover. And here in the article was white letters on a black background through the whole article. And here he refers to a woman in Stanley, North Dakota. Well, of course, being from North Dakota, I woke up at that instant and we corresponded. And I went to that place and found connections that kind of fit, because that's where H.L. Hunt was drilling oil. And it seemed to me that Hunt was very much aware of, see, there were a lot of Finlanders in Stanley, North Dakota. It's way out in western North Dakota in the oil fields. And I found a history of drilling leases that had been computerized at the University of North Dakota. And here Hunt had all of these pieces of land leased by 19, let's say 55 or so. The people living there, a lot of Finlanders, were running for things like county commissioner and mayor as communists openly. Well, you can imagine what Hunt would have thought. What's going on here? And the way I read it, having been there and did a lot of research that's on Harvey and Lee site and so on, my own. If you just Google Severson and Lee Harvey Oswald, a lot of it comes up. It's amazing how the internet just continues to disseminate stuff. I mean, Bart put a 2-hour thing that I did with DP UK on their website, and I've lost track of how this stuff proliferates. And I don't even know how you found it. Did Paul Blue say something to you about me?
No, I found you through other things, but I'm not going to give out their personal on air. I'm going to link all your links in the description. Gary, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, man. Seriously. I respect the work you do, and all your links are going to be in the description. So people can check it out as well too. And your other videos on Bart's site as well. Thanks to everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.